Reading 2 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3, Quaramid, Ugle, September 29, 1945. Commentary on Making Decisions in the Work. In making decisions in the work, the mind must be free from its bondage to mechanical attitudes. Otherwise, you will make decisions always from your personality, from what you have been taught as being right and wrong. This freeing of the mind only begins when you let the work enter into your mind, and so change your mind. It is the will that must make decisions, not the will of your mechanical mind. Will belongs to every center and every part of a center, and in fact to every I. If the work and its ideas have not begun to change your mind, you will always make decisions in terms of your own mind, which judges things in a mechanical way, according to what you have been brought up to think right and wrong. In other words, you are not making right decisions in the work sense, from this laid down, already formed mind that you are using and have always used in life. It is exactly this so-called mind that the work begins to attack in order to lead to change of mind. That is, in order to change the way you think about everything. On one occasion, G was talking about decisions. At that time, I happened to make a note about what he said, which I will now give you in the exact words that I have recorded. He said, quote, "You cannot make a decision from one I. For example, you make a small decision not to smoke while you are sitting quietly. The next moment, you get up and light a cigarette. When you are not in moving center, that is, not moving about, you may make a decision that instantly is forgotten when you begin to move. This is making a decision from a small I, let us say in the intellectual center." End quote. G. G said that these decisions made in small I's, when, as it were, you are in a certain passing state of mind, are quite useless. He added, they are not quite useless because they show you how difficult it is to make a real decision. Such decisions show us how we cannot control our machines, namely, all our centers. He was, of course, speaking about how decisions in the work sense must come from a much deeper level than that on which such small I's exist. Now, as you all know, we make decisions of this small kind continually, as when we have eaten too much, we make a small decision not to eat so much again. And all these decisions are made on the superficial level of the opposites, and are practically always, if you notice, formed in words. Real decisions are not formed in words because they come from a much deeper source. G went on to speak about decisions in the following terms that I will give you just as he said them. Quote, "The ordinary decisions we make are mechanical, and these are quite different from conscious decisions. A man tries to alter one thing without seeing how it is connected with other things. This means that he is not properly conscious, and so he makes a mechanical decision." End quote. Then G began talking about what he called binaries. The word binary comes from the Latin binarius, consisting of two. He gave us an example of a binary. Necessary and unnecessary, these are opposites. He said that a decision in the work sense does not lie in the binaries, but in the neutralizing force, or third force, that turns a binary into a ternary, meaning threefold, or a triad, from Latin ternarius. He said that our life is led in binaries, that is, opposites. This is called the law of the pendulum, under which we are mechanical. He said, you have a dispute with yourself between yes and no. This binary situation in yourself must be transformed by third force and turned into a ternary or triad. In general, man, since he does not remember himself, and so has not got third force in his life, is always swinging between the opposites. That is, his life is always in binaries, which are irreconcilable. This struggle between yes or no is not solved by going either with yes or with no. A third factor has to be found which turns these binaries into a triad or ternary, which no longer resembles the situation that was produced by the state of being in binaries or opposites. Yes or no becomes something quite different, which we can only describe as yes and no. You will remember third force unites the opposites and contains something of them both, and yet is neither of them. When the mind finds something between yes and no, a decision can be made. In G's words, the binary becomes ternary, that is to say, the opposites become included in the triad. And from this a result can take place which leads to what he called a quaternary, which comes from the Latin quaternarius, which is consisting of four. This quaternary is active. It consists in first of all a union of the binaries or opposites through the third force, so making a ternary and leading to a result which makes it a quaternary. Through this result, which in a sense can be called active, as was said, a further development can take place. G said, quote, "Every dispute with oneself should eventually lead to a new state of oneself. It should not give rise to a habitual or accustomed state. It leads to a new state via a ternary, which leads on to a quaternary. As long as the binary state remains, the old state, the former state, will remain, and the person will simply swing back to the old position. The path leading to the knowledge of unity consists first of all in a struggle of yes or no, that is, a binary state to begin with, but it should lead to decision, that is, to a ternary state which is neither yes nor no, and this gives a real result. It leads to a quaternary. A struggle of yes-no is not in itself soluble. A third factor must be found whereby yes and no become combined by a third force into something quite different from yes or no. This forms a ternary, and this forms the result called a quaternary." End quote. G said that the whole secret lies in a man's remembering himself, that is, giving himself the first conscious shock. He said that an ordinary man is incapable of growing or of doing in any real sense because he lacks this third force which is produced by the first conscious shock of self-remembering. There is, he said, a kind of gap in man which he should fill himself, and which, unless he fills it, leads to continuing in binaries. That is, he continues in the opposites. On another occasion, G said, "At this point comes in the individual as distinct from mechanical man. What is the most important thing?" he once asked us. He said, "The most important thing is to realize that we do not remember ourselves, and that for this reason we do not actually exist as individuals in our experience." Now you will see from all that G said that he was talking about something that it takes a great many years to understand, although the work is constantly teaching us this very point. You will notice that he says that decisions cannot be made from the opposites, but from some other force which is neither yes nor no, and that he connects with the state of self-remembering. This state of self-remembering, he said many times, is a state that man was born to possess, but he has lost it. A man is born with the power to remember himself, but as he is brought up amongst sleeping people, that is, amongst people who do not remember themselves, he soon loses this power. He falls asleep himself through the hypnotism of other sleeping people, amongst whom he grows up, and for this reason this work must start with talking about the state that man must reach, which is his birthright. That is why I say to you all that you must practice self-remembering." End quote. G used often to talk about this, and I will give you, in so many words, what he said. He said that esoteric teaching at one time used to be only necessary in regard to the second conscious shock, for man is not born with the possibility of giving himself this shock, and cannot give it to himself unless he is taught how to do it, but that now, owing to the fact that man has fallen so much asleep, he has to be taught how to give himself the shock of self-remembering before anything can be done to transform him. G used to talk a great deal about how man has lost the state given to him at birth, and he used to point to the modern world and say in many different ways that if we want to study how man has lost this state of self-remembering and what consequences have arisen from this loss of consciousness, we have only to look round and see what is happening in this world in which millions of people are behaving in a way that can lead to no solution and can only get worse and worse. No one, he said, now remembers himself or even thinks it is necessary, and for this reason there has been a drop in the level of consciousness, and this level is descending more and more every day, and as a consequence people are becoming more and more governed by external circumstances and more helpless to remedy their troubles. Now let us return to the subject of making a decision in the work. First of all, we are taught to make decisions, but we are taught this, as it were, in order to show us how we cannot keep them, to see, in short, how we are really mechanical. But as you know, this realization of our mechanicalness is one of the forms of self-remembering. We no longer place reliance on our machines, although we observe them at work. We try this and we try that, but we find that it leads nowhere. For example, we do this, and then we find we do not move, and so on. We make effort in this direction and find that as a consequence we make less effort in some other direction. Through self-observation and not becoming depressed and negative by our failure, we can approach a point in which we can realize that decisions cannot be made in this way, that we have been trying to make them hitherto. We find the ground of decisions to lie much deeper than we thought, and so we learn to have this patience towards ourselves, which is so necessary. We begin to see what we want to happen to us to change us, and yet, in a way, we know that we cannot do it ourselves exactly, and that this change that we internally wish for will not come about by making any sudden decisions through small eyes on the opposites, and at the same time we wish for this change to take place however we may feel in regard to it. Then the decision is becoming emotional. It is penetrating much more deeply than the level of small, sudden eyes, sudden forms of self-torture. Now, speaking from another point of view, and yet about the same thing really, it is the third force of the work that can change us. The first thing the work says we can do is to remember ourselves, and in connection with that, it teaches many other things that we can do, such as inner separation from negative thoughts and feelings, and so on. But all these secondary things that it teaches are connected with self-remembering. Take, for example, the teaching of the work about identifying with ourselves or with external events. All this is connected with self-remembering. All this is studying how we cannot remember ourselves because, as you know, if you are very identified with your negative emotions or with the behavior of someone towards you, you are not in a state of self-remembering, but the very reverse. If you are indulging in inner talking and internal considering and self-justifying, etc., you are not remembering yourself. You are not in the third state of consciousness, which is defined as a state of self-remembering. The teaching of the work is to lift us up to this state which we should have and which we were born to have. In this third state of consciousness at this level, influences can reach us which can help. It is as if we put our heads above the water and felt the air and the sunlight. If any of you are trying to remember yourselves at any moment of the day, and if you do it at whatever moment you can, and quite sincerely, you will always notice a sudden brightness round you. Now, if we were in a state of self-remembering, we should know how to make decisions. But when we are asleep in ourselves, when we are identified and worried about ourselves, we make decisions from binaries, as G called them, from the opposites. G said, the struggle between yes and no is not solved by yes or no, the opposites or binaries. If we were always in the state of self-remembering, always in the third state of consciousness, our decisions would be real ones that would lead to a real result, which G called leading to a quaternary. There is a story about a blind girl whose 5 brothers go out into the world, in turn, thinking they can do, but they all fail and become lost in the world. Then the blind girl goes into the world. She does not think she can do, but she holds on to a thread that she has woven, one end of which is bound fast to the sun. She never lets go of this thread, and as a result she can do. She is able to help her brothers and other people in the world simply because she does not trust in herself to find the way, but looks to the thread to guide her. Why is this girl shown as being blind? She is blind to the external world. She does not act through her senses, but she holds on to something internal. Now, if a person could remember himself all the time and noticed everything that caused him to identify, that is, to cease to self-remember, he would be holding on to this thread that comes from the sun, from a higher level. And if such a person's decision were always to remember himself, whatever was happening to him, he would be in the third state of consciousness, and his decision would be a real decision which has nothing to do with opposites or binaries. Yet to ordinary people, it would not seem like a decision, this decision that one should remember oneself, this decision to fight for self-remembering every day in spite of everything.